Welcome to the Jerusalem Post podcast. This week, the podcast hosts Professor Shimon Shetreet, who is also a minister in Rabin's government and has been in Israeli law for decades. He will speak about the judicial reform. You may have noticed that I am not Tamar Uriel-Beeri. It's Pesach, and so this week you are so lucky to have me, Eve Young, Jerusalem Post economics correspondent, and Eliav Breuer filling in as hosts of the J-Post podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So exciting.
It is exciting, yeah.
We don't exactly know what we're doing, but we're going to figure it out for you.
We'll figure it out. And we don't have that much Pesach cleaning to do, which kind of shows neither of us. Yeah, maybe we shouldn't say that on live.
It's like, how are we here?
How are we here?
Much. Or we're not taking vacation.
That's
one
also
or the other.
That's a good point, yeah.
Okay, so lots of big news this week.
Yes.
As always.
Yes.
Did this week, I feel like they always talk on the podcast about what a big news week it was. And then they're like, wait, we shouldn't say that every single week.
Right.
Do we feel like this week was a bit calmer?
I mean, I think this week was a huge news week.
Yeah,
I
feel
right.
that way too. I think it's because you're the political correspondent and I'm the economics correspondent. And it's been an incredible week on those two fronts.
Yeah, there was big economic news this week with the whole Trump's
tariffs announcement. Yeah. Late last week, he announces tariffs baseline 10% for all trade partners with the U.S. and much higher tariffs on tons of countries. Stock markets jumped off a cliff around the world, nosedived, had their worst days since Corona, some negative records even before that. Markets rallied a bit yesterday. So we're a week after the announcement, and I think that today, some of the tariffs were actually enacted. So we're seeing markets not do great things again. They did rally a bit in previous days. Basically, I think there's a ton of confusion, a lot of fear. Economic analysts, like very concerned about what this could do. The big concern is for recession and inflation. And especially in Israel. So in Israel, we were hit with a 17% tariff, which the U.S. said was a reciprocal for a 33% tariff that we theoretically put on U.S. goods. Some Israeli economists were like, what is that number? But I think the big story for Israel is actually recession. Like if there's global recession, if there's recession in the U.S., our biggest, most significant trade partner, we're going to feel the pain from these tariffs, regardless of whether our tariffs manage to be canceled.
Israel's economic situation already, as it is because of the war, isn't that great. So
exactly.
Tariffs could hit us pretty hard, is what you're saying.
Totally. Kind of in terms of like global impacts. Again, in the markets, the last time we saw something similar was coronavirus. And Israel came out of the coronavirus pandemic really well, but it went in really strong. Now we're going in with much bigger deficit, much bigger government debt, a budget that we're struggling. We've been like really battered by the war, huge labor force impact. And also right before this tariffs thing happened, we just kind of started renewing fighting in Gaza.
Yes.
Which will have so many impacts, but also a massive economic impact, possibly, depending on reserves call-ups. And also the renewal of the judicial reform, which we'll touch on more later, but that also had a really big economics impact. Just this week, actually, Israel's Innovation Authority came out with a report talking about emigration and relocation of high-tech workers in Israel, saying there's actually been like really significant emigration, which was a really big concern in the 2023 kind of period of the judicial reform. So that brings us to our next interesting news story, which is kind of to talk to Trump about these tariffs. Yeah. The prime minister flew to the U.S. to meet him. But before we get there, let's talk about how he came there from a trip to Hungary.
Yes. So at the end of the Knesset winter session, right after it ended, Netanyahu finally has some free time.
Isn't it? Wait, can we stop there for a second? Yeah. How crazy that like I didn't see any anger about the session ending, right? Remember the end of the last session? There was a ton of anger. Hostage families were like, how dare you go to recess right now when there are hostages?
I will say that the recess now is much shorter. It's until Independence Day.
Oh, okay.
And most of that is Pesach. So like a lot of Israelis are on vacation anyways. So I think
that's why there's less
there's
anger.
probably less criticism, as opposed to the summer where they went on a 3-month recess.
Yeah, wow.
With basically no holidays in the middle, so it wasn't justified. But so Netanyahu flies a day or two after to Hungary, and in Hungary he goes through a series of meetings, and something very interesting happened right after he landed.
Yeah. Hungary announces that they are leaving the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Before he flew, they were like, we're not going to arrest him, even though there's a warrant.
Right.
And then he landed, and we got that news that they're leaving the ICC.
Right.
Do you have a take on this? I feel like neither of us are very big on international law in our beats, but we'll do our best for the podcast.
Yeah, so as
listeners.
political correspondent, I don't want to go too much into the international law aspect. I will say, though, that it's interesting because this was obviously pre-planned, right? It wasn't by chance. First of all, as we know, there's an arrest warrant out for Netanyahu by the International Criminal Court, and every country that is
like
a
part
member
of
of
the
the
court.
court. Israel isn't actually, but the court, that's part of the legal argument, is whether or not the court has the jurisdiction to arrest the Israeli prime minister. But Hungary is bound to the court. So, according to international law, the Hungarians would have had to arrest Netanyahu upon arrival. They announced already that they wouldn't do it, and this was even a further step, and it took some people by surprise. Not only did they not arrest Netanyahu and buck the international arrest warrant, they even took a further step and left, and basically, left the International Criminal Court and accused it of corruption, etc. So I guess people who think the court is corrupt would definitely be happy about that. People who are more concerned about the international order might take issue. So that was it was an interesting development.
Definitely a big drama this week.
Yeah.
The photos that came out of that meeting were also they were just so stark and dramatic. And I feel like some of the photos that came out of like the meeting reminded me, I feel like they could have been taken 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Like they're just something so like, I don't know.
What do you mean by 40, 50 years ago?
And like, I'm not connecting to any particular event. They have this like very interesting quality to them. It's not like the young, fresh, modern leaders. It's not like Obama bounding off the plane and waving. It's very like red carpet, huge military line of soldiers, like
very
giant,
Cold
like,
War-ish.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Also, I think Hungary. It's not by chance that Hungary is the one who receded from the ICC. Hungary's also been experiencing democratic backsliding for years, and it has experienced friction with the European Union because it's become a lot more isolationist. And interestingly, there's correlation between democratic backsliding often and support for Israel. Meaning a lot of the countries who've experienced democratic backsliding are actually been supporting Israel more. Israel's also experienced democratic backsliding, as we know. So interestingly, in a Netanyahu in a joint press conference spoke very highly about Hungary and about Orban, and it's an interesting twist because this doesn't always happen on trips. But the issue of the Holocaust came up. We had opposition leader Yair Lapid, whose parents are actually Hungarian Holocaust survivors, saying that with all due respect, and the Hungarian regime under, I think his name was Horthy, was a huge part of deporting 800,000 Jews within a year. My grandparents survived, but a lot of their families didn't.
Wow.
So that was an interesting criticism, quite unexpected. And there's another interesting occurrence about the hostages.
Yeah, that's right. The prime minister mentioned the Hungarian hostage, and Lishai Miran Levi, whose husband Omri Miran has been held in captivity since October 7th, said, "Excuse me, Mr. Prime Minister, did you forget his name? A, and B, there are 2 Hungarian hostages." So this wrapped up pretty fairly. The prime minister reportedly called her to apologize. I think it's just like a little moment of like a kvetch, like a pang, like how can it be? You're the prime minister. You are responsible for all the citizens of the country, and especially those in captivity. How can it be that you don't know that? I mean, it's like, I think that it's also fair to say there are still 59 hostages.
Yes.
It's really fair to say that remembering everyone's nationality is a challenge. But yeah, right. I can understand like the pain and the kvetch and the upset feelings. So following
Hungary, you went to the U.S. to talk about tariffs with Trump.
To talk about tariffs, exactly. And that came about, I think, interestingly, they were on the phone. Trump and Netanyahu were on the phone about I forget, like I think there was a call about another topic,
Mm-hmm.
and Netanyahu raised the issue of the tariffs. And the president said, we'll talk about it in person. And that developed into an actual invitation. And Netanyahu, like, directly flying there. There were reports before that he wasn't going to fly till after Pesach, because I feel like normally, like, a Netanyahu visit to the U.S., to the White House, is, like, much more pomp, circumstance, lead up. This was very, like, oh, I'll just swing by, which I think impromptu. And I think people see that as maybe a sign of, like, the closeness and the ability to work together.
On the other hand, it's a sign maybe of, Trump's tendency to improvise and kind of
interesting.
so probably how people take people off guard.
That's interesting. So he flies to the U.S., meets with Trump. Crazy things out of that meeting, right? First of all, tariffs, no clear answer.
Right.
Also, like we said, even if Trump says, you know what, I love you, Israel, you're canceling all tariffs on U.S. goods.
Yeah.
And I think there's also talk of canceling certain taxes on imported U.S. goods, like car imports.
Yeah.
Even if that were to happen and he were to cancel the 17% tariffs on Israel, if there is a continued trade war globally, if there's a recession globally, it doesn't matter. Those tariffs aren't going to make the difference in terms of what it's going to do to our economy, I don't think. Other things that happened in that meeting, Trump announces that the U.S. is going to go into negotiations with Iran.
Right.
Which is traditionally not a stance that Israel likes at all whatsoever. He's talking about speaking with Iran, and also kind of in a very strong-arm sense, like insinuating that there would be maybe repercussions for Iran if they weren't willing to come to the negotiating table. I don't know. What's your take on this? Like, I don't know if it was a surprise for Netanyahu or if he expected it to be announced, but it puts him in a very interesting situation to be prime minister, very publicly against any negotiation with Iran, and then have the U.S.
change it,
pop it out in the meeting.
Yeah, I don't know. I assume that he didn't surprise him on stage, like what happened during the previous visit when Trump brought up his vision for the Gazan Riviera,
which he did also repeat in this.
Which he did repeat in this one. But I assume that Trump probably, if not leading up to the trip, probably told Netanyahu about it in the meeting that preceded the press conference. It is very interesting because I think alongside the announcement that there's going to be direct talks, there's also been, again, I'm not a military reporter, but there's been reports of troop movements that have indicated that there's a credible military threat also, which usually, like in the textbook negotiation under these circumstances, that it makes a lot of sense. Again, as usually happens after Trump does anything, there's a lot of confusion. He didn't say where the talks would take place. The Iranians immediately said it's in Oman, but we don't know will they actually be direct or through a mediator. So there's a lot of questions, but it's definitely a very interesting development.
Yeah. I remember reading reports that like the whole meeting was kind of like exactly what the prime minister would have wanted, except for this like Iran bombshell, which is really significant. And also just kind of not being able to nail the president down on anything to do with tariffs.
I want to say one more thing about that, which is that when he was asked, Trump was asked about the tariffs, he said he would think about it, about reducing or canceling the tariffs on Israeli goods. What he also said, he mentioned, is that, we're paying the Israelis $4 billion a year.
Oh, yeah.
So that's interesting because that, so what he was referring to, of course, an agreement that Obama negotiated beginning in 2016 and signed in 2018. So it was basically a 10-year commitment for $38 billion that the U.S. would pay Israel $3.8 billion every year for
military aid, right?
Yeah, so they're basically giving Israel money so that Israel can buy U.S.-produced weapons. So it's really an investment in U.S. industry, but and that's something that's, that it was before Obama's. Also, there was a similar agreement in place. But it's very interesting because in 2026, negotiations will start over the new. I've heard there's like an official name for it, and I'd be very surprised if Trump is willing to continue giving Israel $3.8 billion a year. He would say, maybe like he did with Zelensky, he would say we'll put it on loan.
Oh, wow.
I actually tweeted about this during the election when, the Israeli right was, rooting for Trump so much. I pointed it out. It's worth thinking about. Is it in the long term? Is this good for Israeli national security? I'm not so sure.
It's super interesting. The kind of Trump is driving a very isolationist line.
Exactly.
We assume that he's going to be Israel's best friend forever, but is that an assumption that makes any sense? Like, I think common word on the street among Israelis is, of course, Trump loves us, but we've seen that Trump's behavior can be really unpredictable and very isolationist.
Exactly.
This tariff thing, it's wildly isolationist. It's kind of pushing, and when the U.S. economy does something like this, it's going to have ripple effects across the globe, but it's pushing, again, for this very isolationist stance of like, no, let's not trade. We're going to make things in-home. We're not going to have a trade deficit. Do your own thing. Like, definitely unpredictable and interesting. And you brought up a negotiation tactic. I feel like we talk about negotiation tactic when we're talking about Trump so much. And I don't know if it's just because the TV show and the Apprentice and whatever, or the art of the deal, but like we hear that like I think so much of what he does is read as a negotiation tactic.
Yeah.
Even tariffs, like there's this idea that like, well, on the one hand he's saying they're permanent, on the other hand he's saying all these different world leaders are coming to talk to me about it.
Yeah.
So like what? It's like what's real and what's a negotiation tactic.
Yeah, it's all reality TV.
Oh my God.
It is very interesting though. I mean, actually, when I mentioned the word negotiations, I actually didn't have that in mind. Again, it's my bias, but I would actually attribute the this balance of credible military threat and direct negotiations to some pretty smart military advisors, and not to Trump himself.
Oh, interesting.
Trump, as people tend to forget, but Trump was actually a failed businessman. He went bankrupt. He became famous and made a lot of money on The Apprentice.
Yeah.
He became famous, right? So he's a great actor and great reality TV.
We don't hear that take enough, especially in Israel. It's an important reminder and an important take that as a businessman, he did go bankrupt, and he also started with a massive bankroll from his father. So
So I don't know. I haven't read The Art of the Deal, but I don't know. Maybe it's worth reading. Yeah, exactly. Some good Pesach reading.
Okay, so we talked a bit about Hungary, and what I was thinking about when you were talking about Hungary and democratic backsliding is that it's actually really popular, the vernacular here of protesters. There are tons of different kind of protest slogans and chants. We don't want to go the way of Hungary.
Yeah.
So let's talk about judicial reform, where we, on our process of democratic backsliding, as some would refer to it.
Yeah.
Where are we at with judicial reform? And let's also tie it into Qatargate, because I think the two have like really come to be maybe one topic.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different parts. I would just say about Hungary that there's part of a global trend where you experience again this concept of democratic backsliding, right? It's based on the assumption that democracy isn't just the rule of the majority. Places like Russia and Turkey and North Korea, the leader could have support of the majority of the people. It doesn't necessarily make them a democracy. So democracy is more than just the role of the majority. It's also a series of individual freedoms: freedom of the press, freedom to, freedom of speech, freedom to gather, to protest, and also checks and balances and independent institutions.
Independence of institutions, yeah.
And it's interesting because a lot of the countries that have experienced backsliding is kind of basically the same textbook, where they would target these institutions and target it. So in Hungary, for example, Orban basically took over the judicial system. It's filled now with judges who are Orban supporters, and then with loyalists, and then you can't know if justice was actually served or not. And what he actually succeeded in doing was also taking over all of the institutionalized media.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so he had people who supported him, oligarchs, rich friends, buy all of the institutionalized media. So you don't have main TV channels, etc. aren't they're basically towing his line. So that's kind of what in Israel we're seeing very similar trend where the judicial reform was the government's attempts to reduce the independence of the judiciary of Israel's court system, which in Israel would be especially damaging because in Israel, there are really only two branches.
The executive and the legislative are the same branch in essence.
Exactly. The government controls the Knesset because the governing coalition is the one that governs and rules Knesset. So it's very important that the judiciary is completely independent. And we saw that, some of that play out this week. People have been talking about constitutional crisis for a long time. And if there's one thing that is a red line for all Israelis, I would say, is if the government doesn't respect the high court ruling.
Let's give us the definition of constitutional crisis.
Yeah.
Because we throw that term around all the time. Let's set a line on it.
Right. So I don't know what the academic definition would be, but a constitutional crisis would be when different branches of government claim the same authority, and then it's not clear who has the authority, right? So, for example, if the High Court rules that something the government did was illegal, but the government ignores the ruling and acts upon what it, and continues with its illegal actions, then the people, at the professional level they're put in the position where they have to decide, right? Do they listen to the government? Do they listen to the court? And this can be dangerous because you have the army and you have the Shin Bet, which is Israel's, kind of like secret police, right? They're kind of like the FBI, but with anti-terror technologies, very invasive technologies.
And not so many kind of limits or checks on what they're allowed to do.
Right. Almost everything they do is classified. And so it's extra important for the Shin Bet, for there to be clear lines and protocols for the Shin Bet to make sure it isn't used improperly. And interestingly, that's reflected in Israeli law. So the Shin Bet law includes the concept of mamlechti, which means that the organization has to respect the state and not just
like the current government
exactly
body.
And it also includes as one of its purposes, it's supposed to fight terror and do counter-espionage, but also to safeguard the democratic institutions. Now, this has all come to a head this week.
It did.
Qatargate. We talked about different authorities in constitutional crisis. The government decided to fire
Ronen Bar.
Shin Bet head Ronen Bar last month. It did so about 2 weeks after the Shin Bet became public knowledge that the Shin Bet was involved in investigating, serious crimes or potential serious crimes about links between Qatar and people associated with the prime minister. There's a court case yesterday, which is a very, very important court case where a series of petitioners petitioned against the firing of Ronen Bar, saying it was illegal.
Which the High Court, right?
Yes, in the High Court. They said it was illegal, first and foremost because of the conflict of interest, right? Netanyahu is the one who's responsible for Shin Bet. If the Shin Bet's investigating Netanyahu, right? If you're a defendant, you can't fire the prosecutor. I mean, in the U.S. you can maybe, but
I've seen a ton of posters like the investigator does not fire the investigator.
Yeah.
I think that's like a really big public sentiment. This feeling of like you don't get to fire the person investigating you. We don't trust that move.
Right. And it's the same thing. Netanyahu's doing the same thing in his criminal. He's also under trial now in criminal bribery, fraud, breach of trust. And the person responsible there for the prosecution is the Attorney General. And lo and behold, the government's trying to get rid of the Attorney General also.
Like the week after they announced the firing of Barr, they announced they were going to vote no confidence in the Attorney General.
Yeah,
right?
So there are fair reasons. The government has the power to get rid of the Shin Bet head and the Attorney General, and it's legitimate. It's a question of process and again adhering to the law. There are laws about how these kinds of decisions are made, and it's very clear to anyone who's even the most basic knowledge. At the court case yesterday, they said second year course in your undergraduate law degree about we call mishpat minhali, administrative law, and none of the rules were respected in Ronen Bar's case. He didn't
Wow.
get a chance for an arraignment. He didn't receive factual evidence. He didn't have a chance to argue his case in front of an independent tribunary, which I think tribunary is the word. Which, anyways, so now the High Court, what it ruled yesterday is basically freezing, and this is my last sentence, freezing the firing of Ronen Bar. It was supposed to come into effect on April 10th, tomorrow.
Wow.
And they froze it for another 10 days, right? For another 10 days. So it's in effect now until April 20th. And they encourage the sides to come to a better agreement in which the government respects the law and goes through due process. It's quite clear that if no agreement is made, but if the government doesn't walk back and give the Shin Bet head due process, the High Court's going to cancel the decision. And our ministers, meaning the High Court's going to say the decision to fire Ronen Bar was illegal and it's not into effect, and now Ronen Bar is the head of the Shin Bet, even though you fired him. There are ministers who are openly calling for the government not to respect the High Court's ruling. And that would be, if that happens, that would be,
Spicy.
the very definition of constitutional crisis. And
Extremely spicy.
Yeah, the country will be, will go into, there'll be immense protests, there'll be chaos.
And I think what's super interesting is that we're not talking about this. Some fears of the crisis are like about the firing of Gali Barav Miara, right?
Mm-hmm.
She isn't the Shin Bet. The Shin Bet is not a toothless organization. It is probably the most toothful organization in this country. It's so toothy. Like, we're talking about a really, really spicy, like I use that not lightheartedly, actually, in this instance. Like, do you have any kind of predictions? I have no idea what would happen. We're talking about the head of Israel's, like you call them, secret police.
Yeah.
Decades of history of use of all kinds of tools that during the corona we kind of discussed, like all kinds of security concerns for private individuals and just how much leeway this organization really has coming to head with the government. That's wild.
Yeah, and so I think the good thing that came out of this whole crisis over the past few years is some of the institutions showed a lot of strength, a lot of backbone. Israel's a relatively young democracy. The Attorney General, it's not just her, right? She has a bunch of deputies in her office, showed staying power and courage. And the Shin Bet also, led by Ronen Bar, is showing courage and a backbone. So even if they get rid of Bar, you can't change the nature of an institution in one day, but you can change it in fairly quickly. We saw that with the police. The police, in the first place, wasn't a very strong organization because of attempts by Netanyahu-led governments of the past 10 years to undermine it. And then fairly quickly it came under very significant control by Tamar Uriel-Beeri. So I'm confident that that's not going to happen in Shin Bet. Shin Bet's a very, very strong organization with very clear moral guidelines. And it's not tomorrow that the Shin Bet's going to start spying on Israeli citizens. But like everything, it's a process. So we need to be heading in the right direction and not in the wrong direction.
And if we're speaking about strong institutions, we know that Israel has also a very strong civil society.
Yes.
And all kinds of really critical organizations, the Histadrut Labor Federation, business associations. Even there's rumors now and reports of a new letter by IDF pilots saying that if kind of Israel becomes no longer a democracy or crosses these constitutional crisis lines, they won't continue to serve. Like, we see a kind of significant pushback against this. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens, and not the fun, good kind of interesting.
Yes.
But I thought it was also interesting that the Prime Minister's statement afterwards, he said it was a puzzling decision by the High Court because he has the authority to make this firing. But he did also say that he would continue to interview candidates, which the High Court did say he could do.
Correct.
So we haven't hit that point yet. He was like, his response was in line with what he is, quote unquote, allowed to do according to the High Court.
Yes.
And I wonder if that kind of bodes what way he'll take in the future.
So, yeah, it'd be very interesting to see. I think, Netanyahu, his roots and his family are, revisionist. They're Begin, it's the pupils of Begin and Jabotinsky. And Begin and Jabotinsky when they were the minority, they were the champions of an independent judiciary and civil rights. So there might be still a bone, deep inside Netanyahu that, puts a red line at disobeying the High Court. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that he's just afraid that if he violates High Court, the High Court will,
win the constitutional arm wrestle.
Yeah, and deem him, or that the civil society will, protest like it did in 2023. I want to say something that people forget sometimes. For months, between 200,000 to 400,000 people took to the streets every single week.
It was wild.
Months.
Like when we compare to America, it's like there were some crazy numbers about comparisons. It's like the population of DC or something.
Yeah, so roughly you can times 30, right? Israel's 10 million, US is more than 300 million. But if you just roughly do it times 30, right? So you have 200,000 to 400 people. We're talking about like 20 million Americans protesting at Capitol Hill, right?
Yeah.
Or sorry, in Tel Aviv, but also there were some major
around the country, really. Yeah.
So there's also it's interesting. There's people who have researched the mass protests and against governments and tried to discern whether or not they worked or not. They call it the 3.5% rule.
I love the 3.5% rule. Yeah.
Which is that if 3.5% people are at protest, that's usually the tipping point after which the government...
for an effective protest and the government stopping whatever.
And that number is 350,000 in Israel. So, it's obviously, it's not really, it doesn't really work that way. But I'm fairly confident that if, the government blatantly violates a High Court ruling, we'll see those numbers, if not more. So I think in the end, things will be okay, I hope.
Amen.
Yeah.
And now to speak more about this, we're going to go to the interview with Tamar Uriel-Beeri, editor-in-chief of the Judicial Report, speaking to Professor Shimon Shetreet. We hope you loved having me, Young and Eliav Breuer, as your fill-in host.
Yeah, we should do this more.
Pesach episode.
Enjoy your matzah.
Mention that there won't be an episode.
Professor Shetreet, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
So right now, the biggest talk in the legal system in Israel is judicial reform this, judicial reform that, legal crisis here, legal crisis there. On the basis of it, do you agree with the concept of a judicial reform in Israel? And if so, do you agree with the format that it's currently being presented by the current coalition?
When the government initiated what they call judicial reform, they came with a bad motive, not in good faith. They didn't want to change, they didn't want to correct, they didn't want to amend, they didn't want to rectify. They want to destroy the system and to create a system of government where the executive has total power over the judiciary, and already they have total power over the legislature because the ministers are leaders of the party in the Knesset, and there is a coalition, and the prime minister also controls the government. So when they started in the beginning of January at the statement, the famous statement of January 4th, Mr. Levin said this is the first stage. The first stage was to control the Attorney General, to abolish judicial review, to create a system of appointment based on personal confidence of the government, of legal advisors, and that was only the first stage. So the whole thing looked like someone is not really initiating correction or amendment in good faith, and therefore things that I used to support, to review the judicial system, at that moment I understood that I cannot agree to any point that they raise. And the last month or 2 months show that they continue with this what you call judicial reform, and I call revolution of the Israeli system of government. They passed the law about changing the composition of the Judicial Appointment Committee. They passed the law about changing the system of judicial ombudsman, that it is both will be totally political.
Yeah.
And that shows that there is nothing that they propose that I can support.
So you've been part, as you mentioned, you've been a witness to Israel's legal system in its full capacity for many, many years, whether it be from a legal standpoint or from a political or from an academic. I'm curious if there's anything you can kind of compare in Israel's history in terms of judicial overhaul, judicial revolution, as you're calling it, to what's happening right now.
There has never been such a plan that, in fact, is intended to create control of the executive of the other branches of government in the way that they did. And therefore, what we had in the past, for example, was to create a court for administrative matters, to create a court for family matters, to introduce a school of judges for them to be trained or to be prepared before they are appointed. All these have been introduced, and but these changes have not been intended to create executive control over the selection of judges or the how courts are managed. And what is happening in this recent 2 years is totally different from what we experienced 70 years. For example, the system of judicial selection committee composed of 3 judges, 2 lawyers, 2 ministers, and 2 members of Knesset was introduced only in 1953. At that time, Ben-Gurion was the prime minister, and he relinquished the power of appointing judges, whether in the Knesset for the Supreme Court judges or by the Department of Justice or the Ministry of Justice. And that was something that was considered to be a move to ensure independence of the judiciary and a process of selection of judges based on merit.
Yeah, based on professional interest rather than political motivation.
And what they did now is to create to wipe out the existing system, and instead of the 2 lawyers, bring in 2 jurists will be elected on a political basis, then one opposition and one coalition. So the whole thing looks totally political, unlike what is required by any standards in the modern thinking of what is judicial independence. We just finished to formulate what we call ELI Mount Scopus standards, European standards of judicial independence, just a few months ago. And of course, the main principle is that the executive cannot have dominance and the politics cannot have dominance. This is what is accepted in many, many countries. Of course, there are exceptions, but according to our tradition that has been established and entrenched for so many decades, this is really a revolution in bad faith.
It's a revolution also in terms of the basis of balance in terms of checks and balances, which is, a bit like the foundation of democracy, in essence. It's completely moving the scales, so to speak.
Yeah, it is a disruption, a total disruption of checks and balances that we don't have in Israel. In Israel, the Knesset, in fact, is controlled by the government, the coalition government.
Yeah.
In fact, the government is controlled by the prime minister. So we don't have checks and balances. Neither do we have a federal system. Neither do we have a bicameral parliamentary system. Neither do we have any international, let's say, human rights convention that we are bound, like the European Convention of Human Rights and such international umbrella kind of values that we are committed to. So we live in a complicated situation.
It's very, very different. I want to turn real quick because you did mention the Attorney General, Gali Baharav Miara, and obviously there are efforts right now to kind of remove her from her position. And this feeds into this overall understanding of some level of the government trying to completely, flip the legal system on its head. But I'm curious, what kind of precedent does it set in terms of legalities, in terms of what's accepted and not accepted in Israel for future generations?
The Attorney General took many decisions during her tenure from when she was appointed. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of decisions, and she represented the government before the courts in thousands of cases. But there has been less than 10 matters in which she decided not to defend and not to accept and not to approve from a legal point of view the moves of the government. That includes, let's say, giving exemption to the Haredim from going to the army. Mm-hmm. That includes issues about matters of dismissal, let's say, of the chairman of a government corporation, the Post corporation, and because she considered it is based on irrelevant considerations and therefore invalid considerations, and the government think that she does not help them to rule. That's what they argue. Mm-hmm. What does it mean it helping to rule? If you are taking illegal decisions and the Attorney General tells you it is unconstitutional or illegal, that's not preventing you from ruling. It's preventing you from not obeying the law, the law of the land. And therefore, the move to take a decision that they don't have confidence in the Attorney General is strange and unacceptable. It is strange because the Attorney General is not an officer that is serving at the pleasure of the government. Our tradition is that the Attorney General serves for a fixed term of 5 years or 6 years, and in that period, the Attorney General is independent and he can take the decision autonomously without intervention or dictation from the government. What this government thinks that whenever their action is declared unconstitutional or illegal, that it is a disruption of their ability to rule. But that's a misconception. And if you think about the procedural aspects, the dismissal of an Attorney General must first go to what we call the search committee that approved when she was appointed. It was approved first by the search committee, and after that it went to the government. Now, they didn't go to the search committee. They immediately make made a declaration that they don't have confidence. They kind of a past no confidence vote, irrelevant from a legal point of view, and from a public or traditional, based on our legal tradition, it is absolutely not supported by any neither logic nor legality.
I do want to turn to, because part of the argument against Gali Baharav Miara as Attorney General is that she is showing preferential treatment to things that oppose the government on almost a personal level. That's the argument that's being made right now surrounding Qatargate, with people surrounding Netanyahu in the Prime Minister's office being put under arrest or house arrest and being investigated. I'm curious how you see Qatargate as impacting this overall legal crisis.
Well, the argument that the people in the Prime Minister's office are targeted is absolutely doesn't have any basis, because the tradition in the Israeli legal system is that investigations were conducted against officers from right and left, and it doesn't matter which government was serving. Investigations were conducted against Prime Minister Olmert, against ministers of the government. Barak, when he was Attorney General, he initiated many investigations at the time, and including prosecuting the wife of Mr. Rabin at the time for, very a matter of little importance, like holding an account in foreign currency overseas, which if you look at it now, you think how, and he resigned because his wife was prosecuted. Look what standards of conduct we had in previous generations of the officers of our government. And look what we have today. Today, all the charges are very serious, including the one that Netanyahu is facing and is trying to maneuver every week, how he will not go to give testimony, including this week, that he first say only Tuesday, that he cannot, and now it says also Wednesday, because suddenly meetings were created in the new schedule. So compared to the past, there has never been a case where a minister will say, I will not obey the judgment of a court. When it happened, the minister resigned. And he resigned because he didn't want to that happened with the Minister of Interior years ago, when a lady conducted a reform conversion overseas, and the court ordered him to register the lady as a Jewish. And he said that I will not do it, and he resigned. Edelstein, when he was ordered to hold the voting about the new speaker, he was ordered, he didn't want to hold it, and he resigned. Now, if Mr. Levin doesn't want to obey the judgment about the president of the court, he should resign. That's the only way. To say I'm not implementing a judgment is almost a criminal offense. But in terms of the public sphere of it, constitutional order, this is totally unacceptable in a normal society that respects the rule of law values.
I'm curious because I see a lot of comparisons being made amongst people who oppose the way the government has been managing this entire legal overhaul I'm curious if you think that some of its origins in terms of this like feeling that they can kind of handle anything and go against the legal system and not face any reparations as a result, do you think that it's impacted in part by the government's strong foundation in partnership with U.S. President Donald Trump from his previous administration as well as right now? Because Trump also sort of has this approach of nothing can beat me down, nothing can bear me down. No matter what, even though there are charges against him in trials that have been open in New York and in Florida and so on.
When the legal revolution or judicial revolution was introduced and the protest began, if you remember, President Biden decided not to invite Prime Minister Netanyahu as a kind of reprimand and disapproval of what he initiated. That means his Minister of Justice initiated with his support, his full support. And but now there is a different climate, and I assume this different climate gives Netanyahu a kind of a sense of confidence from the exterior relationship.
Right.
But you see, the main issue today is that all these legal suggestions are in fact trying to change the rules of the game.
Right.
Because we had crisis in the past. We had crisis, I don't know if you remember Wadi Salib in the 50s when the newcomers staged protests all over the country. We had crisis in Altalena when there was a clash between one gun and one force against the multiple militias or something like that could develop if Ben-Gurion didn't say, that's it. Only one gun, only one power. It's the government that has the authority to control power, not any other group. So in all these cases, all the reparations from Germany dispute, very acute dispute, emotionally and historically and so on. But all these issues, all these disputes did not touch the rules of the game. What they do now, and what if you take all the proposals together, if you in sum, it is an attempt to change the system of government and the rules of the game. And I think the sense of confidence could be that it is now gaining additional support from the climate that has been created.
Yeah. That's kind of the overarching thought when it comes to opposition to the legal reform. I'm curious because you're saying rules of the game, but the rules of the game aren't properly foundationalized in Israel. Do you think that that's part of the problem, that we don't have a proper written down constitution?
It would have been much better if we have completed the constitution, and the first step is to pass a basic law that relates to legislation.
Yes.
How legislation is passed, what are the limits for legislation. Today, after the main two landmark decisions from last year on the issue of reasonableness or abolition of the ground of review on reasonableness, and the issue of the disability, these two cases laid the decision that not only regular laws are subject to judicial review of the Supreme Court, but also basic laws are subject. They are subject, to the ban or to the limit of not abusing the constituent power of the constitutional assembly or a constitutional framework. And secondly, that any legislation, including the basic law, must conform with the core values of the Jewish and democratic state of Israel. These two cases today, in fact, have to be implemented into this basic law legislation. And then once we have this, and we have all the 11 chapters already in the Constitution, then it is possible that we complete the written document that will be called Constitution. At the moment, we have a system of constitution similar to the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
The United Kingdom has many, many statutes or pieces of legislation that deal with constitutions. For example, in 2005, they passed what they call Constitutional Reforms Act, which introduced quite a few reforms, separated between House of Lords, the Judicial Committee, from the parliamentary two houses of parliament. It changed the position of the Lord Chancellor. It created a Judicial Selection Committee of 15 members with no political membership in that committee. So it had, of course, the UK Human Rights Act years ago. So they also had a system of building. For them, for centuries. For us, it's only decades.
Right.
We are young. We are young as a state, but we are very ancient as a nation,
Including in England.
including in England. Yes. So I would say that it's time to complete the Constitution, and the first step is to complete as soon as possible the basic law legislation. But at the moment, it looks that as long as this government is ruling, it would come as a very distorted constitution, because it would have a political judicial selection. It will have a climate of chilling the independence of judges. It will have a climate of chilling effect on the legal officers, the law officers in the country. And therefore, I hope that if we move towards this direction, it has to be by general consensus, wide consensus. If it is done by, so to speak, 68 members, this is not democracy. Democracy is not only the formal majority in parliament, which is decided in the polls once in 4 years. Democracy is respecting the rule of law. Democracy is assuring freedom of speech, and they are trying to abolish, for example, the Khan corporation, the public
Broadcasting Company.
Broadcast company, and democracy means all the human rights of free speech and assembly, etc. And it includes judicial independence. It includes many aspects, and therefore, to say we have a majority, then we can rule. No. Even if you have a majority, you have to take into account the limits that you are under by tradition or by the essence of the values of the rule of law. And therefore, I hope that if we initiate this enterprise of completing the constitutional framework of our country, that it will be and it should be by general consensus.
And it would be a safety net of sorts. I'm curious if you think that the same concern exists about the government's involvement or over-involvement, if the same kind of concern exists surrounding an October 7th Commission of Inquiry. Do you think that should be kind of a 50-50 thing between the government and the legal side, more legal than government, vice versa?
We have already from 1968 a law that says when there is a issue of vital importance, then the right form is Commission of Inquiry. Commission of Inquiry, the government decides, but the appointment is in the hands of a neutral, independent, impartial institution, which is the Supreme Court of Israel. Now, we have done it after the Yom Kippur War. We have done similarly after the Second Lebanon War. And we have appointed it, for example, when I was in the government, when Baruch Goldstein killed so many innocent people, Muslims, that they were praying in the tomb of the patriarchs. Mm-hmm. We appointed a committee, and unfortunately, after the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, we appointed also a commission of inquiry. There have been so many occasions where we appointed commission of inquiry, and 7th of October, disaster, massacre, some people call it Holocaust, which was the most serious event in the history of Israel and since the Holocaust. And so, not to appoint a commission according to the present tradition, according to the present law, it is only because you are afraid and because you don't want to be accountable for what you have done. And the more months and weeks that go, we hear about new problems. Mm-hmm. The problems, for example, is that there was a conception that they don't want to have the Palestinian Authority, and they wanted to weaken it. So they gave money. They actually gave money to Hamas. I mean, one time that the prince decided not to continue to give the money, the prime minister sent Yossi Cohen, the head of the Mossad, to convince him to continue to give the money. So this has to be inquired by impartial, and the impartial doesn't mean that 50-50 based on politics. That's not impartial. This is like a bipartisan issue in labor law. But this is not labor law. Mm. This is not a trade union vis-a-vis the management. This is the core of the existence of our country. And we have to learn from the failures that took place before and on and after. There are also arguments about misconduct of the war, and not only about why the war or the attack came, and we think that it was a surprise attack, but it was not a surprise attack. We helped build this terror organization, and now the Qatar Gate add to this issue that has also to be how the Muslim brothers got access into the most holy of our government. Mm-hmm. Could you imagine the office of the prime minister and the most close aides of the prime minister are dealing with Qatar at the same time that we are in a war, that Qatar is supporting Hamas, and that's not an issue whether it is an enemy or it is not enemy. It behaves like enemy. Mm-hmm. The money that was poured into the American universities to create Middle East departments that are full of anti-Semites and full of anti-Israelis and teach anti-Israeli doctrines. This was money from Qatar, billions and billions. This is certainly hostile, and only the enemy of Israel can do this type of thing. And of course, to support a Muslim brother organization like Hamas is the same. And Al Jazeera is the most hated, not only in Israel, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, and therefore all this have to be inquired into by impartial, neutral, independent or procedure. And the only way is what we have established over so many years and practiced, which is called Commission of Inquiry, that are appointed. I mean, the decision is taken by the government, but the composition is decided by the Supreme Court.
That'll keep it clean, I'm sure. Thank you so much, Professor Shetreet.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
There will not be a Jerusalem Post podcast episode next week. We're very sorry, but we also need to go on Pesach vacation. We hope that you watch some other news and enjoy yourself.
Yeah.
Or take a break from the news. That's even better.